Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Politeia, otherwise known as Republic. I recently had a conversation with ChatGPT, the AI chatbot, about Plato, and because it's fed publications found on the internet, it has a very mixed bag of ideas, but unlike a dialectician, it can't resolve the contradictions. So, on the one hand, it assumes that Plato says things in the dialogues, but when confronted with the fact that Plato doesn't say things in the dialogues, it knows that. It recognizes the fact that there are characters in the dialogues, but then says that the characters speak for Plato. Or, in dialogues such as Euthydemus, a dialogue entirely about eristics, it is clear for some reason that Plato doesn't support eristics, and therefore this is a dialogue presenting the problem of eristics. But when confronted again with the idea that dialogues therefore present ideas without actually saying anything explicitly, which might be considered to be Plato's views, the chatbot regressed to the idea that Plato says things in the dialogues at least part of the time, and that's how we get the idea of what Plato thinks. When I asked for one serious argument in any of the dialogues which may be attributed to Plato, ChatGPT chose the cave analogy, which is in Book 7 of Politeia. Even if I began a reading of Politeia today, it would take years before we reached the cave analogy in Book 7. But luckily, I've already published a book on Politeia, a complete analysis which no professional seems to have read. So I thought that this would be a good time, straight after the other very short summary of my analysis of Hippias Major, to say a few things about Politeia now, before I get on with reading another dialogue. For the sake of brevity and clarity, I will present everything now dogmatically, but of course in the book and in the 30 years or more of research on the dialogue, I was far from dogmatic. In fact, here I'll begin with the conclusions, which I presume is where Plato began structuring the dialogue. He began with the idea which he wanted to present in the dialogue, and worked down from there through the aspects, the paradeigmata, and then the deigmata. For this dialogue, Plato began, as so often, with the idea of the good. This he divided into the beneficial, pleasure, and an apparent good, reputation. He further subdivided pleasure into one, a few, and all pleasures. These aspects of the idea of good cannot, of course, be dramatized in themselves, and for each one, Plato creates a paradeigma, a person who lives according to that particular good. None of the paradeigmata is intended to be a role model. The paradeigmata are simply aspects of the good, so that we may be able to understand the good in all its aspects better. In particular, these various ways of understanding good affect our understanding of justice. Each of the paradeigmata has a particular view of justice. Justice pertains to doing good to others, and this is affected by one's understanding of the good and who we should be concerned about. An account of each paradeigma is actually given in the dialogue, unfortunately not by Plato himself, but by Socrates, which provides us with a bit of a problem, because Socrates is talking to people who are not philosophers, who do not understand the truth, and Socrates is not even trying to give them the truth, he's trying to make them think for themselves. Therefore, the accounts are slightly problematic. Not too problematic, but quite problematic. But in addition to the accounts, we also have deigmata, actual characters who are these paradeigmata, with additional details to make them more engaging and palatable to the reader, or to allow comparisons between various types of deigmata of one paradeigma. The job of matching each deigma with a paradeigma is made a little more difficult, because sometimes one deigma appears to be like another deigma. It is the job of the dialectician to see through appearance to the reality of the dialogue. Once the reality of the dialogue has been uncovered, the whole dialogue makes sense. Until then, it doesn't make sense, no matter what people say. A lot of the things said really are nonsensical. In earlier dialogues, Plato didn't have Socrates give paradigms names as such. We can understand that one paradigm might be the dialectician, and another one would be the sophist, and then Socrates and, for example, Hippias would exemplify these paradigms. But here, because there are 5 different paradeigmata, and they are not the usual sort of paradigm, we are given names for each paradeigma, and these are political. The person following benefit is the aristocratic, the person following reputation is the timocratic, the person following a few but necessary pleasures is the oligarchic, the person following any and every pleasure as it comes is the democratic, and the person who realizes that everybody else has all the pleasure that he lacks is the tyrannical. Socrates introduces each account of a constitution of soul with an analogous constitution of a polis, but these are absolutely unhistorical, unreal, and are really simply the soul described in another way, as if they were like a polis. As I've already said, the accounts are rather problematic, but we also have the deigmata, the characters themselves, and there are clues littered all over the dialogue which allow us to identify each character with a paradeigma. And these characters, being dramatically real, are far more accurate than the accounts of the paradeigmata, and we learn a little more about each paradeigma. For example, the oligarch is concerned with just a few necessary pleasures, drinking, eating, and sex for procreation, but we learn from Cephalos, the old man who is actually the deigma of the oligarch, that he is also controlled by fear of punishment for all the bad deeds that he has done in life. Socrates talks with all the pleasure-dominated deigmata in Book 1, in increasingly long conversations, mainly about justice. First with Cephalos, and then his son Polemarchus, who is the Democrat, or one of the Democrats. There's also Cleitophon. There are 2 Democrats to show that they enjoy, among other things, playing at being one of the other paradeigmata. Polemarchus plays the aristocratic, and Cleitophon plays the tyrannical. And then Thrasymachus is the tyrant. Remember that these political names are only for convenience. They do not represent actual political constitutions. Thrasymachus is tyrant only in name. He's a sophist, and he is the most harmful character here, and he's the opposite of Socrates, who is the beneficial person here. He's a dialectician. Socrates aims to make people think coherently and logically for a good end, while Thrasymachus is angry and is prepared to overturn logic itself in order to take from other people any pleasure they may have. A dramatic token of pleasure in this dialogue is money, and Thrasymachus does everything he can to earn money from other people. Socrates, the dialectician, is one type of beneficial person, and he's the aristocrat, one of the aristocrats. Other aristocrats are poets and the parents of timocrats. These parents and poets are beneficial in that they lie and deceive in order to make people behave justly, if only for the wrong reasons. Socrates can do this as well, but he also has the ability to make people actually change their constitution if they begin to think dialectically, and he does everything he can to make people begin to think dialectically by giving them lots of contradictions in their own thinking. He presents to them their own internal contradictions. The two timocrats, Glaucon and Adeimantus, have been brought up to appear to be just. They are aware that hedonism is not the best way of life, but they are completely unaware of benefit. They have no idea why their father did what he did in the polis. Therefore, they spend all their time appearing to be good by appearing to be just, but they are more and more inclined to acquire the trappings of good reputation as far as they're concerned, which means high office, a good marriage, wealth, all things which they have found out recently they could have got more easily by being unjust. They've heard this from Thrasymachus and other people like him, the tyrannical types. Because the timocrats are so concerned with reputation, they are only concerned with the opinions of others. And this is what we see in the cave analogy. The timocrats are looking at a wall upon which are thrown the opinions of aristocrats on the one hand and tyrants on the other. Socrates, trying to make a difference, also has to throw his opinions onto the wall. Actually, he's throwing their own opinions onto the wall in order to make them think dialectically, but they never do. The cave analogy is a representation of what happens in the dialogue, with Socrates throwing ideas and opinions onto the wall for the benefit of his timocratic interlocutors. The dialogue and the analogy are full of contradictions.